I heard the laughter before anyone noticed me standing there, and that was usually how it went. Marines on the long-range line tend to forget the world behind them when a target refuses to cooperate. That morning the wind was rolling across the hills like a slow, invisible tide, pushing heat waves over the gravel and making the distant steel silhouette shimmer at 1,700 yards. One sniper after another squeezed the trigger, each shot carefully calculated by tablets, wind meters, and ballistic charts worth more than the pickup truck I drove onto the base 20 years ago. Every time the rifles cracked, the spotters leaned into their scopes, waiting for the metallic ring that never came. Instead, there was silence, followed by the scrape of boots on gravel and the quiet frustration of professionals who weren't used to missing. I rested both hands on the wooden handle of my broom and watched the flags along the ridge snap and twist in different directions. The wind was doing what it always does in that valley, telling 3 different stories at once. A young Marine muttered something under his breath after the 3rd miss in a row, and another one laughed, the kind of laugh that tries to hide irritation. Then a voice cut across the line, sharp and impatient. "Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Miller." I'd heard his voice before. "Is this some kind of joke?" he barked, staring downrange through binoculars as if the steel plate itself had insulted him. The man beside him adjusted a sleek rifle resting on a bipod and shook his head. Computers said the shot was perfect. The wind meters said the shot was perfect. But the steel target out there on the hillside kept ignoring them. Miller turned slightly, scanning the line behind him, and that was when his eyes landed on me. An old man in faded work jeans holding a broom wasn't exactly part of the sniper program's plan for the day. His brow tightened. "Sir," he said, not exactly respectful. "Civilian areas are back near the parking lot." A couple of the younger Marines glanced over their shoulders, and the smirks spread fast. I didn't move. I had seen that look before on younger faces than theirs. The look that comes when someone thinks experience expires like a carton of milk. One of them nudged the other and said loud enough for half the line to hear, "Guess the janitor came to watch the show." I leaned slightly on the broom and studied the wind flags again. The one closest to the firing line leaned right. The one halfway to the ridge leaned left. The flag by the target barely moved at all. Heat mirage rippled above the rocks like water boiling in slow motion. Miller followed my gaze for a moment, then shook his head and turned back toward his shooters. Another Marine settled behind his rifle. The bolt slid forward with a smooth metallic click. The valley went quiet again as everyone waited for the shot. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing against the hills, and the spotter's voice came a second later. "Mississippi low right." The laughter came again, thinner this time, the kind that tries to keep pride from showing cracks. Miller exhaled through his teeth. I could almost hear the frustration grinding behind his calm. I shifted my weight and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "You're reading one wind." He turned halfway toward me, irritation already forming on his face. I nodded toward the valley. "There are 3. The line went still for a moment. Then one of the younger snipers chuckled. "3 winds," he repeated, amused. Another Marine said, "Yeah, sure." I didn't argue. I simply looked back out over the hills where the sunlight bent through layers of air most instruments couldn't feel. I had been watching wind like that since before most of those Marines were born, and the valley hadn't changed a bit. I watched the grin spread across the line like someone had just told a good joke, and in a way they had. Marines are used to confidence, especially on a sniper range, and the idea that an old man holding a broom might understand wind better than their instruments sounded ridiculous to them. Gunnery Sergeant Miller looked at me for another second, weighing whether I was worth the trouble. Then he shook his head and turned back toward the firing line. "Focus on your shooting," he said to his Marines. "Not the commentary section." A few of them chuckled again, but the sound was thinner now, edged with the frustration of a morning that was not going their way. The young sniper who had just missed shifted his body behind the rifle and cycled the bolt, with a metallic click that echoed lightly across the gravel. Another Marine stepped forward with a handheld wind meter and held it into the breeze. The small digital screen blinked numbers that were supposed to simplify the entire valley into a single calculation. Miller leaned over the shooter's shoulder and spoke quietly, guiding the adjustment. The rifle settled again, steady and precise. The barrel pointed at the tiny steel silhouette almost a mile away. I watched the flags along the ridge twist like restless birds. The nearest one leaned right again, snapping sharply for a second before falling slack. Halfway to the ridge, the second flag drifted in the opposite direction, slow and lazy. Above the rocks near the target, the air shimmered and bent the sunlight in a wavering ribbon that moved in a different direction entirely. The Marine fired. The sound cracked across the range and rolled down the hills. Everyone waited. The spotter leaned forward into his scope, silent for 2 long seconds. Then he sighed. Mississippi high this time. The frustration was no longer quiet. One Marine slapped his hand against his leg and muttered something under his breath. Another shook his head and stared downrange like the steel plate had personally insulted him. Miller rubbed a hand across his jaw and slowly turned around again. His eyes settled on me once more, standing exactly where I had been before. You still here? He asked. I nodded toward the ridge. Wind has not changed, I said calmly. It rarely does. People just read it wrong. That earned another round of laughter, louder this time, and one of the younger Marines stepped away from the line with an exaggerated shrug. His name tape read Brooks. He looked at my broom first, then at my face, and the grin widened. You know, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. If you have got the magic answer, you should probably tell the gunny. A couple of the others leaned on their rifles, enjoying the moment. Brooks pointed downrange toward the tiny steel target glowing faintly in the sun. 1,700 yards, he said slowly, like he was explaining basic math. Best shooters on the base are missing all morning. But the janitor figured it out. The laughter rolled across the firing line again. I rested both hands on the broom handle and looked past them at the hills. Instead of their faces, the valley wind brushed across the gravel, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed grass. I had stood in winds like that long before their computers existed. Brooks tilted his head slightly. So go ahead, he said. Explain the 3 winds. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I studied the mirage boiling above the rocks halfway downrange. It slid left for a second, then flattened, then drifted back the other direction like a slow river, changing its mind. Brooks waited, still smiling, expecting another joke. Finally, I lifted one hand and pointed downrange. The first wind touches your face, I said. The second lives halfway to the ridge. The third rides the heat over the rocks near the target. Miller crossed his arms, listening now despite himself. Brooks shook his head with a grin. 3 winds, he repeated again, but this time his voice carried a small note of curiosity under the humor. I nodded once. And the bullet flies through all of them. The line went quiet for a moment, not because they believed me yet, but because for the first time that morning the valley had stopped laughing. I let the silence sit on the firing line for a moment because silence has a way of making people listen harder than words ever could. The wind slid across the gravel again, light but restless, brushing the loose dust against my boots. Private Brooks was still standing there with that half-amused grin, but it was different now. The laughter had faded just enough for curiosity to slip in. Gunnery Sergeant Miller studied me with his arms crossed, the kind of look a man gives when he is deciding whether something is ridiculous or simply unfamiliar. Behind him, the other Marines shifted their weight, rifles resting on bipods, scopes pointed toward a steel target that had refused every calculation they threw at it that morning. Brooks glanced downrange and then back at me. All right, he said slowly. If the bullet flies through 3 winds, which one are we supposed to listen to? I lifted my chin toward the valley. All of them, I answered. A few of the Marines shook their heads immediately, but 1 or 2 of them followed my gaze toward the hills. The sunlight had climbed higher now, and the air above the rocks was bending into a shimmering ribbon that twisted left and right like it could not decide where to go. The nearest flag cracked sharply for a second and then sagged again. The second flag near the ridge leaned the opposite direction, slow and steady like a lazy river. Brooks noticed it too. His grin faded a little. That does not match the meter, he said. Miller took the wind reader from one of the shooters and held it into the breeze again. The small device chirped softly and displayed its neat row of numbers as confident as ever. Miller studied the screen, then looked downrange, then back at me. Technology tends to work, he said evenly. I nodded once. So does experience. Another Marine behind him snorted quietly. Brooks rubbed the back of his neck and glanced again toward the distant target. You really think that is why we are missing? He asked. You are solving one problem, I said. The bullet has to solve 3. That sentence hung there in the morning air longer than the others had. Brooks lowered his eyes toward the ground for a second, thinking it through the way good shooters do. Miller watched him with a slight frown, but said nothing. Then Brooks surprised everyone by taking a slow step closer to me. "So where would you hold?" he asked. The other Marines immediately leaned in a little, pretending they were not listening too closely. I rested both hands on the broom again and looked out across the valley. The hills had not changed in the last hour. The wind still told the same 3 stories if someone knew where to look. "Your first wind pushes right," I said calmly. "Your second pushes left halfway to the ridge. The third barely moves, but the heat above the rocks lifts the bullet." Brooks stared at the distant hillside like he was trying to see the air itself. One of the Marines beside him whispered something under his breath, but Brooks ignored it. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped forward again, his boots crunching over the gravel. He stopped about 10 feet from me and studied my face carefully now, not with irritation, but with the slow focus of a man piecing something together. "You talk like you have done this before," he said. I shrugged slightly. "A few times." The Marines behind him chuckled again, but the laughter had lost its confidence. Brooks glanced down at the rifle resting on the firing mat, and then back toward the target glowing faintly in the sunlight nearly a mile away. Finally, he folded his arms and tilted his head at me. "All right," he said, a little louder so the rest of the line could hear. "If the janitor understands the wind better than the sniper team, maybe we should give him a rifle." A ripple of laughter rolled across the firing line again, but this time even Gunnery Sergeant Miller did not laugh. He looked at Brooks, then at the rifle on the mat, then back at me. The valley wind brushed across the gravel again, quiet and patient. For a long moment nobody said anything. Then Miller exhaled slowly and spoke with a calm voice that carried across the entire line. "You think you can do better, sir?" For a moment, the only sound on the range was the wind moving across the gravel and the distant creak of the steel target swaying on its chain almost a mile away. Gunnery Sergeant Miller's question hung in the air between us. "You think you can do better, sir?" A few Marines exchanged glances, some amused, some curious, and Private Brooks folded his arms as if he had just set a small experiment in motion. I studied Miller for a second before answering, because tone matters more than words on a firing line. "I think the wind is doing exactly what it has been doing all morning," I said calmly. "And I think you are fighting the wrong part of it." Brooks tilted his head slightly, intrigued now instead of amused. Miller looked down the line at the rifles resting on their mats, and then back at me again. "You shoot much?" he asked. I shrugged a little. "Enough to know when the air is lying." A few of the Marines chuckled again, but the laughter faded quickly. Brooks glanced toward the rifle nearest to him, a sleek modern precision rifle with a long scope and a bipod planted firmly in the gravel. He rested a hand on it and looked back toward Miller. "Gunny," he said carefully, "we have been missing for 2 hours." Miller did not respond immediately. He studied me again, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place something about the way I stood there watching the valley instead of the men. Finally, he nodded once toward the rifle. "All right," he said slowly. "Let us see this 3-wind theory." Brooks immediately stepped aside and gestured toward the firing mat with exaggerated politeness. "After you," he said with a grin that had returned but softer now. I did not move toward the rifle. Instead, I turned and walked toward the back of my pickup truck parked just beyond the gravel line. The Marines watched with puzzled expressions as I lowered the tailgate and reached into the bed. The canvas bundle inside had been there longer than most of those Marines had been alive. When I lifted it out, the fabric sagged slightly with familiar weight. Brooks raised an eyebrow as I carried it back toward the firing line. "That does not look like government-issued equipment," he said. I knelt beside the mat and slowly unwrapped the canvas. The rifle beneath it was walnut and steel, dark with age and careful use. It looked almost simple beside the modern rifles lined across the range. A few of the Marines leaned forward to get a better look. One of them let out a quiet whistle. "That is old," someone murmured. Brooks crouched down slightly, examining it with open curiosity now. "What is it?" he asked. "M40, I said quietly. "United States Marine Corps." Miller's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. "That model has not been standard issue in a long time," he said. I nodded. "Neither have I." The Marines laughed again, but the sound was respectful now rather than mocking. Brooks pointed toward the stock where the walnut carried a long, shallow gouge along the grain. "What happened there?" he asked. I ran my fingers lightly across the scar in the wood. For a moment, the gravel range faded into memory, and the smell of warm dust turned into humid air and jungle leaves moving above my head. The sound of wind flags snapping became the rustle of tall grass somewhere far away in another year. Brooks noticed the way I paused and tilted his head slightly. "Old story?" he asked. I nodded once and looked back toward the distant steel target shining in the sun. "Old wind," I said quietly. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped closer now, no longer amused, studying the rifle with a thoughtful expression. Brooks slowly backed away from the mat, giving me room. The other Marines watched in silence as I settled behind the rifle and rested it gently on the bipod. The valley stretched out in front of me exactly the way it had all morning, 3 different winds telling 3 different stories across 1,700 yards of open ground. I placed my cheek against the stock and looked through the scope, letting the distant hillside slide into focus. Behind me, I heard Brooks whisper softly to one of the others. "Well," he said, "I guess we are about to find out." I settled behind the old rifle and let the world narrow down to the scope and the wind. The Marines behind me shifted their boots on the gravel, trying not to crowd too close, but unable to look away either. A moment earlier, they had been laughing at the idea of an old janitor understanding a 1,700-yard shot better than a trained sniper team, but now curiosity had replaced most of the humor. The walnut stock rested steady against my shoulder, familiar in a way that modern rifles never quite are. Wood carries memory. Steel carries patience. I adjusted the rifle slightly on the bipod and studied the valley through the glass. The steel target shimmered in the heat almost a mile away, small enough to disappear whenever the mirage bent the air. The first wind brushed against my cheek from right to left, gentle but steady. That was the wind everyone could feel. It was the easy one. The second wind lived halfway to the ridge where the tall grass leaned slowly in the opposite direction. It moved like a quiet river against the first. Most shooters never noticed it because they were too busy trusting the instruments in their hands. The third wind was harder to see, but impossible to ignore once you knew where to look. The heat rising from the rocks near the target lifted the air in slow, twisting currents, pushing anything passing through it slightly upward and slightly sideways. A bullet flying 1,700 yards had to travel through all 3 of those invisible rivers before it ever reached steel. I stayed still for several seconds, watching the mirage slide across the hillside. Behind me, someone whispered something I could not quite hear. Private Brooks crouched nearby, studying the flags again like he was trying to see the wind the way I did. Gunnery Sergeant Miller had moved a little closer as well, arms folded across his chest, saying nothing but missing nothing either. I slowly adjusted the rear bag beneath the stock and settled the crosshairs just to the side of the distant target. One of the Marines shifted his weight and whispered to another, "That rifle does not even have half the adjustments ours do." Brooks answered quietly, "Maybe it does not need them." I exhaled slowly and let half a breath remain in my lungs, the way I had done thousands of times before. The valley wind brushed across the gravel again, and the flag snapped for a second before falling still. The mirage flattened for just a moment, like the air itself had paused. That was the window. My finger tightened gently on the trigger, and the rifle spoke with a single clean report that rolled across the hills. The recoil nudged my shoulder, and the scope dipped before settling back on the target. For 2 seconds, nobody said a word. Then the spotter behind me leaned harder into his scope and suddenly sucked in a sharp breath. The sound carried across the firing line before the word even came out of his mouth. Impact. The steel plate rang a moment later, a bright metallic note that drifted back through the valley like a bell. No one laughed this time. Boots scraped the gravel as several Marines stood up at once, trying to confirm what they had just heard. Brooks stared through the spotting scope again as if the target might change its mind and move somewhere else. Gunnery Sergeant Miller lowered his binoculars slowly and looked from the distant steel plate back to the rifle resting in front of me. The valley wind continued moving exactly the way it had all morning, 3 quiet currents crossing 1,700 yards of open ground. Behind me, Brooks let out a quiet breath that sounded halfway between disbelief and respect. "Gunny," he said softly, "I think the janitor just solved the problem." For several seconds after the steel rang across the valley, nobody spoke. The sound faded slowly into the hills until the only thing left was the wind brushing over the gravel and the faint clicking of someone adjusting a spotting scope. I stayed behind the rifle without moving, watching the mirage settle back into its slow, twisting pattern. Above the rocks near the target, the valley had not changed. It rarely does. What changes is the way people finally learn to see it. Behind me, boots shifted again as a few of the Marines stepped closer. Careful now. Almost quiet, the way people get when something unexpected happens right in front of them. Private Brooks leaned over the spotting scope again like he needed to confirm the steel plate was still swinging. "That was center," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than before. One of the other Marines shook his head slowly. 1,700 yards, he muttered. With that rifle. I gently lifted my cheek from the stock and pushed the safety on before sitting back from the firing mat. The walnut rifle rested calmly on the bipod like it had been there all morning, waiting for someone to listen to the wind. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped forward, his boots crunching softly across the gravel. He did not say anything at first. He simply picked up the binoculars again and looked toward the distant target one more time. The steel plate was still rocking slightly on its chain in the sunlight. When he lowered the binoculars, his eyes moved to the rifle, then to me. "You accounted for the second crosswind," he said slowly, more like a statement than a question. I nodded once. "And the lift near the rocks." Brooks looked up from the spotting scope immediately. "Lift," he repeated. I pointed downrange without standing. "Heat pushes air upward. The bullet rides that column if you do not adjust for it." Several of the Marines turned their heads toward the shimmering air above the rocks, as if they might suddenly see the invisible current holding the valley together. Brooks rubbed his chin thoughtfully and looked back toward the flags again. "So the meter is not wrong," he said. "It is just incomplete." I smiled slightly. "Meters measure the wind where you stand. Bullets travel where you do not." The Marines exchanged glances, some nodding slowly as the idea settled into place. Gunnery Sergeant Miller remained still for another moment, studying the rifle resting on the mat. Finally, he crouched down beside it and looked more closely at the worn walnut stock. His fingers hovered near the long gouge carved along the grain, but he did not touch it. "This rifle has seen a lot of miles," he said quietly. "More than most of the equipment on this range." I picked up the canvas wrap and folded it loosely in my hands. "It has seen a few winds," I answered. Brooks straightened up and looked between Miller and me, the grin from earlier completely gone now. What replaced it was something better. Curiosity mixed with respect. "Sir," he said carefully, "how long did it take you to learn to read the wind like that?" I looked back toward the valley where the three currents were already shifting again in the warm afternoon air. The nearest flag snapped once and drifted left. The tall grass near the ridge leaned right in slow motion. The mirage above the rocks began to ripple upward again like steam rising from hot pavement. "Long enough," I said quietly. Behind me, one of the Marines gave a low whistle, and another one shook his head in disbelief. Brooks looked at the rifle again, then back at the distant target, and finally toward Gunnery Sergeant Miller. "Gunny," he said softly, "we have been doing this range the same way for years." Miller stood up slowly, still looking out across the valley where the steel plate hung in the sunlight nearly a mile away. After a moment, he nodded once. "Maybe," he said, "it is time we start doing it the right way." The wind shifted again across the valley, but this time every Marine on the line noticed it. That was the difference. Before the shot, they had been looking at screens and numbers. Now they were watching the hills. Private Brooks stepped away from the spotting scope and walked slowly toward the flags planted along the gravel edge of the range. He stood there for a moment studying how the fabric snapped and then sagged again. One of the other Marines joined him, then another. Nobody laughed anymore. Gunnery Sergeant Miller remained near the firing mat with his arms folded, his eyes moving between the distant steel target and the rifle resting quietly in front of me. The valley looked the same as it had all morning, but the atmosphere on the firing line had changed completely. Brooks walked back after a minute and crouched beside the rifle again, studying the old walnut stock as if it might answer questions by itself. "You saw all that before the shot?" he said, not really asking. I nodded toward the hills. "It was there the whole time." Brooks glanced downrange again. We were staring straight at it, and still missed it. I rested my hands loosely on my knees and watched the mirage ripple above the rocks. That happens more often than people think. A Marine farther down the line raised his hand slightly like a student in a classroom. "Sir," he said carefully. If there are 3 winds, how do you decide which one matters most? I pointed toward the ridge where the tall grass leaned slowly against the breeze. Distance decides that, I said. The farther the bullet travels, the more every change along the path matters. Brooks nodded slowly, thinking through the idea. Gunnery Sergeant Miller finally stepped forward again and looked down at the firing mat where the modern rifles were still lined up like instruments waiting for another attempt. All right, he said calmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Everyone back on the line. The Marines moved quickly but quietly, taking their positions again. Brooks lay down behind his rifle and adjusted the bipod, while another Marine settled beside him with the spotting scope. Miller looked toward me for a moment. Stay where you are, he said. I want them watching the wind the way you do. I nodded once and remained just behind the line as Brooks settled into position. The valley stretched out in front of him exactly the way it had earlier. The steel plate hung 1,700 yards away, bright against the hillside. Brooks studied the flags for several seconds before touching the adjustment knobs on his scope. First wind pushing right, he murmured to the spotter beside him. Second wind halfway out pushing left. The spotter glanced toward the mirage above the rocks. Third wind lifting, he added quietly. Brooks breathed out slowly and let the rifle settle against his shoulder. The Marines along the line watched without speaking. Miller stood with his hands resting on his belt, calm but focused. The wind brushed across the gravel again, and the nearest flag snapped once before falling still. Brooks waited. The mirage flattened slightly above the rocks, and the tall grass near the ridge leaned just enough to show the second current sliding across the valley. Brooks squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the sound rolled out across the hills. Everyone leaned toward the spotting scope. 2 seconds passed. Then the clear metallic ring drifted back across the valley again. The steel plate swung gently in the sunlight. A low cheer rose from the Marines on the line, not loud, but filled with relief. Brooks lifted his head from the rifle and looked back toward me with a grin that carried more gratitude than pride. Gunnery Sergeant Miller nodded once, watching the target settle again in the distance. The wind moved quietly across the valley exactly the same way it had all morning, but now every Marine on that firing line could finally see it. The cheer on the firing line faded slowly into a quiet kind of pride, the kind Marines do not shout about, but carry in the way they stand a little straighter. Private Brooks stayed behind his rifle for another moment, watching the steel plate settle back into stillness 1,700 yards away. The wind moved across the valley exactly the way it had before, brushing the grass near the ridge and twisting the mirage above the rocks in slow shimmering currents. Brooks finally lifted his head and looked back toward me with a grin that no longer carried any trace of mockery. Same wind, he said quietly. We just did not see it. I nodded once. Now you do. Several Marines along the line were already studying the flags again, pointing quietly toward the hills and comparing what they saw to the path Brooks had just calculated. Gunnery Sergeant Miller watched them for a moment, arms folded, satisfied but thoughtful. The sound of an approaching vehicle rolled faintly across the gravel road behind the range and grew louder as it came closer. A dark green-based truck slowed near the firing line and stopped beside the equipment shed. The door opened and a tall officer stepped out, his uniform crisp in the afternoon sunlight. The Marines noticed immediately and straightened instinctively. Miller turned his head and nodded once in recognition. Colonel Hayes, he said under his breath. The colonel walked across the gravel with calm, unhurried steps, studying the line of Marines and the rifles laid out before them. His eyes paused on the distant steel target, still swaying slightly in the breeze, before moving to Gunnery Sergeant Miller. Heard some noise from this range, the colonel said with a faint smile. Sounded like someone. Finally solved the problem. Miller nodded toward Brooks. Private Brooks made the correction, sir. Brooks stood up immediately and gave a quick respectful nod. Yes, sir. Colonel Hayes looked down the valley again, clearly impressed by the distance. 1,700 yards, he said. That is not an easy classroom. Brooks glanced toward me for just a moment before answering. We had some help, sir. The colonel followed Brooks' gaze, and his eyes landed on the old rifle resting on the firing mat beside me. For a second, he did not move. Then he stepped closer, studying the walnut stock and the long gouge running along the grain. His expression shifted slightly, not surprise exactly, but recognition trying to find its place. That rifle, he said quietly. I picked up the canvas wrap again and folded it loosely over my arm. It still works, I answered. Colonel Hayes crouched beside the mat and looked more carefully at the steel receiver where faint letters had been engraved long ago. The wind lifted the edge of his sleeve slightly as he read the worn inscription. When he stood again, his expression had changed completely. He looked from the rifle to my face with the slow certainty of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been sitting in the back of his mind for years. Daniel Mercer, he said calmly. The name moved through the firing line like a quiet echo. Brooks looked between us with wide eyes. Gunnery Sergeant Miller straightened a little, understanding settling in at the same time. Colonel Hayes nodded once, almost respectfully. I read your field manuals when I was a young lieutenant, he said. Most of this range program is built on the wind tables you wrote. I shrugged lightly and glanced back toward the valley where the three currents were still crossing the hillside in patient silence. The wind wrote those, I said. Brooks stared downrange again, then back at the rifle, and finally at the colonel. Sir, he said slowly, you mean the guy who taught half the Marine Corps how to read long-distance wind? Colonel Hayes gave a small smile and nodded once. That would be him. The Marines on the firing line grew quiet again, but this time the silence carried something stronger than curiosity. It carried respect. The quiet that settled across the firing line after Colonel Hayes spoke was deeper than anything that had come before it. The wind moved softly across the gravel, lifting a little dust that drifted toward the valley and disappeared into the sunlight. Private Brooks looked at me, then at the rifle resting beside the mat, and then back toward the distant steel plate hanging 1,700 yards away as if the distance itself had suddenly changed. Gunnery Sergeant Miller straightened slowly and glanced down the line at his Marines. None of them were laughing now. None of them were whispering either. They stood there watching the hills the way soldiers watch something important. Colonel Hayes folded his arms lightly and studied the valley for a moment before speaking again. You know, he said calmly, every long-distance shooting manual on this base mentions 3 wind layers. Most Marines memorize the words. He looked toward Brooks and the others along the firing line. Very few actually see them. Brooks rubbed the back of his neck and shook his head slightly, still processing everything that had happened in the last few minutes. Sir, he said slowly, we have been training on this range for months and never realized the valley was doing that. I glanced toward the ridge where the tall grass leaned gently in the afternoon breeze. The wind does not hide, I said quietly. People just learn to ignore it when the numbers feel easier. A couple of the Marines nodded to themselves as if the lesson had settled deeper than a normal range correction ever could. Gunnery Sergeant Miller stepped closer and looked down at the rifle again, then back toward the hills. Well, he said after a moment, I think today's class just got extended. A few of the Marines smiled at that, but the smiles were respectful now rather than amused. Brooks crouched again beside the rifle and ran his eyes across the valley, carefully following the flags, the grass, and the mirage just like he had before his shot. 3 winds, he murmured softly. I nodded once. 3 winds. Colonel Hayes gave a small approving smile and looked down the line of Marines one more time. Gentlemen, he said, you just received the most valuable instruction this range has seen in years. The Marines stood a little taller at that. Brooks rose to his feet and faced me directly, the easy grin he had worn earlier replaced by something steadier. Sir, he said sincerely, thank you. I shrugged lightly and lifted the old rifle from the mat, wrapping the canvas around the worn walnut stock the way I always had. The rifle felt exactly the same in my hands as it had decades earlier, solid and patient. The wind brushed across the valley again, shifting the flags and bending the sunlight above the rocks in the distance. Nothing about the hills had changed all day. Only the way the Marines were looking at them had changed. Gunnery Sergeant Miller nodded toward my truck parked beyond the gravel line. You heading out? He asked. Just finished my work, I said. Brooks watched as I walked toward the tailgate and placed the wrapped rifle carefully back inside the bed of the truck. When I closed the tailgate and turned back toward the range, the Marines were already watching the wind again, pointing quietly toward the ridge and discussing the direction of the second current across the valley. Colonel Hayes stood beside Miller, both of them looking downrange with calm satisfaction. Brooks glanced back toward me once more and then turned his eyes toward the hills. The steel plate hung in the sunlight far away, waiting patiently. The wind moved across the valley exactly the way it always had. And this time, every Marine on that range finally knew how to read it.